Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event entitled Natural Capital Moving from Concept to Implementation. Just to introduce myself, I'm Richard Howard. I'm Head of Environment and Energy here at Policy Exchange. I'm just going to give a brief introduction and I'll be chairing today's event. I should just say there's a few spare seats right at the front. If anyone's standing at the back, you can grab a seat right at the front. So just to kick off, I kind of assume that there's going to be a mix of knowledge about natural capital. Some people probably know an awful lot, and some people probably know very little. So we'll start from basically first principles and start with the basics. So natural capital, why is this important? It's essentially about the natural environment, the parts of the natural environment that provide people with value. That includes forests, farmland, rivers, wildlife, urban green spaces, and which all provide value in terms of water, clean air, food, fuel, and other benefits, flood protection, recreational benefits, and so on and so on. So it's about sort of everything, the entire natural environment. But why do we call it natural capital? It's because essentially the approach is around thinking about the value of those assets and the value of the services, the goods and services that they provide. So you could say that the value of these assets has sort of historically been taken pretty much for granted. Until recently, we haven't really thought about these things as having a value in the conventional sense of the word. But that has been changing over the last 10 to 20 years, with natural capital coming in as a kind of term and gradually becoming part of essentially government policy. It's not just about putting a price on things and a sort of boring economist's idea of valuing something just for the sake of it. That's not what this is about. It's about informing decision making. So by putting a value on something, you can then use that to drive better informed decision making and more efficient decisions, making sure you're not depleting those capitals or underinvesting. That is essentially what this is about. So as I say, the natural capital concept has been developing for some time. Probably the biggest step forward was in 2011 with DEFRA's white paper on the natural environment, which argued essentially that we need to have a properly functioning natural environment in order to have sustained economic growth. So it linked the natural environment very much to economic growth. And it made a number of very specific proposals, one of which was to aim to have a net gain in the value of nature over time. And also one of the things in this paper in terms of how this could be put into practice was the creation of the Natural Capital Committee, of which Dieter Helm was the chair, and that's existed since 2012. So the Natural Capital Committee has produced a number of reports which have explored this, looking at the economic benefits that stem from natural capital and looking at ways in which you can value natural capital. And the other reports looked at the need to develop a longer-term framework to think about restoration of natural capital and also identify some specific investments that could offer environmental and economic returns. It's worth saying that this whole area around natural capital has gone right up the agenda and has become a sort of cross-party agenda. So all three of the main political parties had said something about natural capital in their manifestos for the general election. And the Conservatives said that they would continue with the work of the NCC over the course of this Parliament. So essentially the terms of this debate is less about whether we'll do something on natural capital, it's more about how and when we'll put this into practice, hence the focus of today's discussion being really about implementing this concept. And in my mind, there's implications of this both for business and for government. And in both cases, it's firstly about getting the basics right in terms of actually measuring, reporting natural capital, and then secondly, embedding that into decision making. So we'll hear from the speakers, in particular, Mark Goff, who's joining us here today from the Natural Capital Coalition, has done a lot of work thinking about how businesses actually measure and report on their natural capital and how they can bring that into their own decision making. I'm hoping Barry can give us Barry Gardner can give us some insights into the political dimension of this and how it could come into government policy. So really the questions for today are around how natural capital can be valued and reported, how we can build it into decision making, how it can influence wider policy across a whole suite of spheres, whether it's flooding, energy, all sorts of policies, impact on natural capital impacts on all sorts of policy areas. And lastly, how natural capital investments could be paid for. There's a key kind of financing question around all of this. So that's really my introduction. We've had a slight change of format for today's session. Barry's unfortunately got to go to a vote in the Commons at 3:45 on English votes for English laws, which seems like a reasonably important thing to go to. So he's going to have to head off, but before he goes, he's going to just give some opening remarks, and hopefully he'll join us afterwards for some of the panel discussion as well. So Barry, for anyone who doesn't know Barry, Barry's the Shadow Environment Minister, and prior to that he sat on the EFRA and EC committees and has held a variety of environmental roles. So he's well placed to talk about this topic and has spoken extensively about natural capital. After Barry's talk, Professor Dieter Helm will give us a keynote speech, which will last about half an hour. Dieter will be known to many of you. He's an Oxford University academic, but importantly in this context, the chair of the Natural Capital Committee and the author of a book, which you'll find at the back of the room. You're able to purchase at the end of the event and even get it signed. A book on natural capital, Valuing the Planet, which was published earlier this year. And finally, joining us on the panel today is Mark Goff, who is Executive Director of the Natural Capital Coalition. It's different from the Natural Capital Committee, which is essentially an alliance of businesses who are looking at looking to develop methods for natural capital valuation and to embed this in their decision making. So Mark was previously, we used to work together at the Crown Estate, where we both worked together on trying to get the Crown Estate thinking about natural capital and integrated reporting. And this is something Mark's been working on in several roles, but most recently on the Natural Capital Coalition. So today's session will last until, the actual formal parts of this will last until 3:45, 4 o'clock, and then we'll have Q&A with the audience as well. I hope to finish by about 4:30, and then we'll have a book signing at the end and close. So I'll hand over now to Barry for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Richard, thanks very much. And a huge thank you to Dieter, I think, not only for allowing me to sort of go first because of the vote, but actually the work that Dieter and the Natural Capital Committee has been doing over the past 3 years has been incredibly exciting and really groundbreaking. I wanted to begin by quoting, "When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you've had your technical success." That was J. Robert Oppenheimer reflecting on his development of the atomic bomb. Natural capital valuation is not the atomic bomb, although I'd happily argue that its capacity to transform society for good is potentially a great deal more powerful. But the Natural Capital Initiative were right to warn in a report that they published just 2 weeks ago that there is an urgent need for a well-developed discussion about the ethics of natural capital valuation. We've got to engage in this discussion properly to provide proof that we're not putting the technically sweet before the morally relevant. Natural capital valuation is a tool that enables us to do what I take it that all of us here are already determined and committed to do: to conserve, to protect, to bequeath to our children the means to achieve a standard of living at least as good as our own, and the capacity to meet their own similar responsibility to the subsequent generation. But natural capital valuation doesn't just help us, the good people, do the right thing. Its real power lies in enlisting to our cause those who are quite happy to do the wrong thing. It gives those who don't share our motives a clear and increasingly quantified basis to take the right decision regardless of their interest in the intrinsic worth of landscapes, biodiversity, and our incredible ecosystems. It propels them to the right decision because it is the most economically efficient decision when one factors in a fair assessment of the valuation of all the externalities. It is a powerful tool for policy making and for policy delivery. Now, it has to be a dangerous rhetorical maneuver to quote Oppenheimer and Oscar Wilde within a minute of each other, but hell. Nowadays, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. This is the public's accusation from those of the public who should be our natural allies, but who worry that we, who believe in the power of the natural capital idea, have gone over to the dark side and are now simply trying to monetize things. They see natural capital as dangerous, as potentially providing a license to trash. They're concerned that by highlighting nature's instrumental value, we corrupt its intrinsic value. In other words, there's a zero-sum relationship here. Now, the Pope warns in his encyclical that our freedom fades when it is handed... Oh, yeah, that's Oppenheimer, the Pope, and Oscar Wilde. We're doing well today. It's great, guys. Our freedom fades when it is handed over to the blind forces of the unconscious, of immediate needs, of self-interest, and of violence. This moral hazard is very real. Many of you will remember the Conference for Nature that was held at the Royal Society just over a year ago. It was a great title. We've got to be clear that ultimately what natural capital valuation is saying is not, look what nature can do for us, but whatever we do for nature, we do for ourselves, and whatever we do to nature, we do to ourselves. Professor Giles Atkinson pointed out, to make natural capital into a useful tool, we need to ensure it resonates with different audiences, principally the public. And Georgina Mace summarizes the challenge very simply. As natural capital arose from the natural sciences, we tend to view it from the supply side in ecosystems. However, it's also important to think about the demand side in society. So what I'm trying to emphasize at the beginning of this debate is that before we can move to the vital question of today's event about how to implement natural capital in policymaking, we have a key task of convincing the public that we have the moral authority to do so. If we were to choose to end the disastrous subsidy for the burning of our uplands for grouse moor, we would permanently reduce flood risk, improve water quality, reducing water bills incidentally, and increase carbon sequestration. This is how I would push this policy change through Whitehall. But it would only be a part of my own motivation. A future where the low glide of the hen harrier is a frequent sight on our uplands would be for me an equally powerful reason. And for many of the public, who are, let's face it, little interested in the regulation of the water industry and whether their return on capital should be capex or totex basis, it's actually the most important reason. With amateur shooters paying more than £150 per brace of grouse, destroying the true value of the uplands to breed the maximum number of grouse makes sound business sense. It also adds to the already significant net worth of shooting estates because the capital value of a grouse moor is based upon its grouse population. Now, the government has set ambitious targets to improve the ecological condition of important habitats and halt the decline of England's biodiversity. But it's far from certain that those goals are going to be met. We can't expect our land managers or our farmers to take a leadership role here, certainly not with that business equation stacking up, without governments setting clear targets, removing perverse subsidies, and setting clear regulatory frameworks. National Ecosystems Assessment showed that understanding the economic value of ecosystem services is both practical and essential to maximize positive outcomes for biodiversity, to deliver increased public benefit, and to achieve value for money in public sector expenditure. Where landowners fail to manage their land to a good standard, there's a real cost to society, a real injustice that shouldn't be ignored. Natural capital valuation can give us the means to require land managers whose land use erodes the public good to rebalance those losses, to restore that balance. Local development plans, which all local authorities are obliged to create, include the core plans required to make decisions about land use in an area over the coming 25 years. And one of the great things that the Natural Capital Committee has done under Dieter's leadership is to actually talk about preparing 25-year plans so that the government is looking at this long term. And although produced within local authority planning departments, those plans draw together all the key areas of local authority policy under one umbrella. The policies and plans that they outline are crucial for shaping the future of our landscape in this country. Now, before the last election, my party committed to devolving an extra £30 billion over 5 years down to local authorities to engage in that process. That was to give local authorities the security to invest in prevention, to build more homes, to invest in better transport infrastructure, to build more livable communities, all of that. But where I think the input was most important was that those plans needed to be linked to 5-year natural capital budgets. Budgets which either the Natural Capital Committee or its follow-on successor would have to then lay out. Budgets that deliver the ongoing job of getting us towards that 25-year target and deliver on the Natural Environment White Paper, deliver on the UN requirement for fully integrated natural capital satellite accounts by 2020, which the government has already signed up to. It seems to me that there's a model that can be developed in government, which is to say, if you have a long-term 25-year goal about how to expand the natural wealth of the country, the public goods that are available to people in ecosystem services and stocks as well as flows of natural capital, then the burden on government is then to manage it. The burden on government is then to say, right, let's look at how we budget, not how to use it up, but how we budget to expand it. And that's where Natural England comes in. That's where the advice that Natural England can give to local authorities in preparing their development plans should absolutely be coming to the fore. Because, let's face it, we all know that the LEPs have ignored entirely the local nature partnerships when it comes to incorporating what needed to be done into those regional plans. But a body like Natural England, that's properly resourced, and of course at the moment it's not, but a body like Natural England that was properly resourced could provide that, could provide a structure guided by the Natural Capital Committee's 25-year plan, reinforced with 5-year budgets for the expansion of natural capital, and then delivered at a local level by the LEPs and the local nature partnerships working in conjunction with Natural England, getting the technical advice that they need to increase the public good for all of us. Thanks very much.
Thank you to Richard, to the Policy Exchange for inviting me along this afternoon and setting up this important event. And although we hadn't planned it originally, it's actually great to follow Barry since he set such a great concept. And I should say too that Barry's been extremely supportive of the Natural Capital Committee through its 3 and a bit years. And indeed, that's a support that's been shared across at least what was at the last election, all 3 major political parties, all of whom in their manifesto endorsed not just the natural capital approach, but much of what the Natural Capital Committee had recommended, and in particular Barry's paid attention to the 25-year plan which we suggested ought to be the framework for taking forward this agenda. What I'd like to do is speak in largely a personal capacity. We all in the Natural Capital Committee have views about the different components of the arguments, although much of what I say will follow the framework of what the Natural Capital Committee has done. And for those who are not aware of that, there's a website, but particularly the third annual report, which came out in January, I think, or maybe February this year, summarises the 3 years' work we've done and what we as a committee proposed ought to be done going forward. But I'll deviate away from that, and in particular, Richard asked me to focus very much on the moving from concept to implementation, so I'm going to raise a number of policy areas from the green belt to green spaces and cities, river catchments, agriculture and so on, which the Natural Capital Committee has only had time to touch on in tangency. So these will be very much my own views. In order to take the natural capital agenda forward, there are really kind of 4 bits. There's getting the concept right. There's being very clear what the objective is. There's having a framework for measuring what's going on. And obviously, there's a set of policies to implement. And I'll touch on the first 3 of those, concepts, objectives, and measurement, before I turn to the policy, which will be the substantive part of what I want to cover, and how it's paid for, which is obviously crucial. The concept is a hard concept. Unlike the concept of sustainability and sustainable development, which has dominated the environmental movement for at least a quarter of a century, this is hard, whereas that's woolly. Who can be against being sustainable? But when you ask what's it mean, it can be attached to virtually anything, and almost anybody can claim they're being sustainable in their actions. That's not to say it isn't a good concept, but natural capital is about assets. It's about the maintenance of those assets and the enhancement of those assets. And it's every bit as hard as talking about man-made capital, and it's, to extent, almost harder than talking about human capital. It integrates immediately the natural environment into the economy and moves away from that ghastly Marxist dialectic idea, them versus us, proletariat versus bourgeoisie, the environment versus the economy, capitalist versus the environment. This sees the environment as absolutely core to any productive activity in the economy. The difference between natural assets and other kinds of assets is natural assets are everything that nature gives us for free. That's extremely important. We don't have to manufacture them. We may have to manage them, but we don't have to manufacture these assets. And there are 2 sorts of these assets, and this distinction is extremely important. There are renewable and non-renewable natural assets. Now, this has got nothing to do with windmills, just before we get excited about renewables and so on. It's to do with the different characteristics. A renewable is something that nature will go on giving us forever, or until evolution catches up with it, as long as we maintain that asset above the threshold by which it can no longer sustain that. It applies to habitats, it applies to ecosystems, but the easiest example to say is, providing you don't overfish herring in the North Sea, for every generation into the future, as far as it'll go until evolution or some cataclysmic thing happens to the North Sea, there will be herring to be rewarded and be kept and caught and used by humans for that continuous period. That makes the value huge unless you apply a hard discount rate to it. This resource is there, and it turns the other way. If you take it below the threshold, then you've lost the whole lot of that future value. So you really worry about renewable natural capital assets, And the ones that you're most concerned with are those which might go below the threshold. It's a real simplification of the problem to say we don't have to worry about every natural asset. We worry about those things that matter, the crucial infrastructures that are in ecosystems of primary importance, the crucial species and so on, which might fall below those thresholds. The rest of them will look after themselves. Non-renewables are the stuff that nature gives us, but are going to take millennium to replace. Things like coal, oil, gas, limestone, minerals, all those kind of things. The problem there is quite different from the renewable one. Someone's got to use them. Now, you might say leave the oil in the ground because the externalities are too great, but put that aside for a moment. Someone's got to use them. But if one generation uses them, then you have to think what's left for the next generation. How do we compensate the next generation for the fact we're definitely not going to have this asset available to them because we used it? Think about my generation's selfish consumption of the North Sea oil and gas, leaving nothing for future generations. What you should do is set aside the economic rents from the depreciation of non-renewables and invest that in assets for the next generation so that you've spread the benefit of the non-renewable through future generations. Now, that's the conceptual bit, but it really matters. Nearly everything I'm going to talk about is going to be about renewables rather than non-renewables, except one bit about financing. Now, that's about the concept, the objective. The objective in the white paper in 2011, and the reason why, when I was given the privilege of being chairman, I wanted to do the job, was because it set absolutely clearly the objective that this is going to be the first generation that stops the rot of the natural environment and leaves the next generation with a better natural environment than it inherited. That's a very, very important objective. It says the current state of our natural environment is suboptimally low. There are enormous benefits for having more environment in the natural capital sense, and we then need to set about doing that. It's absolutely explicit. Now, in my book, I formalise that as an aggregate natural capital rule, the rule that the aggregate of natural capital must never decline, and I set up some rules about the extent to which that aggregate must be just renewables, or the extent that the depletion of the non-renewables can be in man-made capital and other components. It matters a lot how you do that, but that objective sets up what the Natural Capital Committee has done, the 25-year plan that Barry mentioned, etc., and it sets up the argument that I have in the book. Now, if you do believe that you do not want your natural assets to decline anymore, because you believe the depletion has gone so far that to go further would create an extremely suboptimal state, then certain principles follow. And just an aside, because there was Matt Ridley in the Times took a swipe at that idea, I think actually an exceptionally, extremely poorly argued one. Do remember that in this century, when you worry about climate change, it's quite possible we might take out half the species on this planet by 2100. Do remember that at 3% economic growth, 2 to 3, at the global level, the world's consumption level will be 16 times its current level. If China grows at its current rate, it'll be 257 times as big. And do remember we have to accommodate 3 billion more people on this planet over this century as well, and give them all the requirements to live a decent life if we can. So it's not as if this isn't a huge challenge that's in front of us. And if you want to preserve every natural asset, you have to explain how you can possibly contain what's required to support that population without damaging some assets. Of course we're going to damage natural capital in different places, different ways. You can't do much. In fact, nearly all human history has been about imposing upon natural capital. The point here is the rot has gone too far, and if you want to maintain the aggregate, then there are certain policy measures that follow. The most important is the concept of capital maintenance. If you're going to leave an asset intact, then you have to provide sufficient capital maintenance to offset any depreciation. Think about roads. If you let the potholes get bigger and bigger, you're worse off than you were previously. You have to do capital maintenance to keep a road system working. You have to fill the holes in. Well, similarly, you should be doing that for our infrastructures generally and natural capital in particular. Take a look at national income accounts. There are no assets. There's no capital maintenance. That's why quite a lot of our infrastructure, and I several years ago had the privilege working with James in the front here and looking at infrastructure more generally in the UK, that's why quite a lot of our infrastructure is in the state we're in. If you want to get an increase in GDP, well, neglect the capex, let the capital maintenance go by the board and pump out the cash. That's what GDP national income accounts do. So capital maintenance is the provision of sufficient monies to ensure the assets don't decline. Don't kid yourself you're better off because GDP has gone up 3%, unless it's 3% net of capital maintenance. And that, and work by Colin Mayer in particular in the Natural Capital Committee, and there's a discussion paper on this, looks at how you do the accounting to ensure that's the case. But imagine if George Osborne tomorrow had to declare how well we're doing by saying, I've been a good steward of the assets of the economy as a whole, I provided for proper maintenance, and now this is how well the economy is growing net of paying that capital maintenance. That would be radically different. And I put to you the economic growth rate for the last 25 years has not been as declared in GDP. Mrs. Thatcher had peak to peak and trough to trough 1.7% growth on average. Okay? But we depleted the entire North Sea, or most of it, in the process and had a party at the expense of future generations. Are we really 1.7% per annum better off because we run down an asset? I think Macmillan had a little phrase about selling the family silver. This is about not maintaining the family silver and misrepresenting how well our economy is actually doing. And that's hard, not soft. That's not an environmental point. That's about actually measuring whether an economy is going forward in economic growth terms in any meaningful way. So the first thing is capital maintenance. The second thing is compensation. These are general policy requirements. I'll come to specifics in a second. So capital maintenance should be core to national income accounts, just as it is to water company accounts and others that use so-called CCA accounting principles. But the second principle is compensation. If you believe that the aggregate of natural capital should not go down, if you follow the rules I set out in my book in respect of that, then for every piece of damage you do, you must compensate with some improvement elsewhere. Otherwise, you can't maintain the capital stock intact. Okay? And this is just a very core capitalist principle. Property rights, at the absolute core of any market economy, are defined in a way which says if someone else infringes your property rights, you can sue them for compensation. If you accidentally drive your car through my front fence in my garden, it's your job to put the fence right. There's nothing non-market about this. This is absolutely the core. And countries that don't do property rights properly, like China and Russia and arguably Greece, are examples in the broader sense of how going away from the protection of property rights leads to economic inefficiencies and sometimes chaos. What we're saying here is this should be applied to natural capital. It's a property right. It's a part of the assets of any economy. So if you want to build a housing estate on the small field on the edge of my village in the Cotswolds, which also happens to be in the Prime Minister's constituency, there's an argument for doing that. The fact that it floods regularly seems to have passed the planners by, but never mind. Flood Re will force all the rest of us to compensate the people whose houses will be built and be flooded subsequently. But if you want to do that, and you take out a meadow at the edge of the village where the village kids play, you should say those people you're going to damage, because they no longer have that opportunity, should be compensated. Now, down the road, a couple of miles, is a nice nature reserve run by BBOUT, the Wildlife Trust, which I have the privilege of being the vice president. It's perfectly possible for those developers to buy 20, 30, 40 acres of agricultural land, which we can add to our nature reserve, which will make the aggregate of natural capital in our area much greater and give much more access to wildlife for the people in our village and the use of those green spaces than would otherwise be the case. And these compensation principles, which I set out in the book, and they're very much my views on this subject, give enormous opportunities. Now, people say, oh yes, but that's a license to trash. Well, let's be brutal. If you're going to build 300,000 houses a year and do high-speed 2 and Heathrow runway, etc., you are going to trash some natural assets. There's no question about it. And I'm not against any of those things. I don't want to express a view about those things. But there will be damage. But if the gains are so great that they're worth doing the damage, then the gainers can compensate the losers. And in any serious market system, they should do so. That's what the compensation principle is about. And if you apply the compensation principle, there is no decline in the aggregate natural capital in the economy. Full stop, because every bit of damage is compensated. Now, you don't have to do like for like. Lots of people who've thought about this in the audience, about how offsetting all that stuff works. You might not necessarily replace the field that's going to go under houses in my village with a field next to it. There might be something else that's much more worthwhile. All that one's concerned about is the aggregate, but the details matter. Now, the third principle after capital maintenance and compensation is that if you pollute, you should pay for the pollution you cause. Externalities should be taxed. And if you perversely subsidise things which are doing a lot of damage, you should get rid of the perverse subsidies. Now, we understand this with carbon. People are perfectly au fait with the idea that a carbon price is a way of making people pay for the damage that emitting carbon does. But somehow they don't think this is appropriate to pesticides, herbicides, and nitrates applied to agricultural land. But these things damage. They do enormous damage in certain circumstances to our flora and our wildlife, etc. Farmland birds, particularly flowers and plants. But also, the water company has to clear up the mess as a result and invest in capital, hard capital, which all of us pay for in our water bills. We wouldn't tolerate this from any other industry in our economy. This kind of inability to confront people with the consequences of their action is a core economic inefficiency. Not to price externalities means that economic growth will be lower because the efficiency of the economy will be lower. But to perversely actually encourage them to do this damage, which is what much in the Common Agricultural Policy has done, is nuts. The agricultural contribution in our economy, and this is not against farmers. Farmers are really efficient at working to incentive structures. It's about the incentive structure itself being wrong. Agriculture contributes about 9 billion in total output to the economy, not 100 billion as the NFU claim. They include every burger van and everybody else within the frame, or the entire food industry. Of that 9 billion, 3 billion is direct subsidies. And then if you add up all these other contributing costs that are imposed by the agriculture and the exemption from all sorts of taxes, from petrol duty to all the other bits, there ain't much left of the 9 billion. Surely as a society and as an economy, we can do better than that. We can improve this outcome to the net benefit of the economy and to the benefit of farmers. They'll work to whatever incentive structures put in place if we think about those subsidies. So you tax the polluters, you make polluters pay, principle of capitalism, principle of property rights. If you damage the river, if you damage the water quality we have to drink, you have to pay for it, and perverse subsidies should be taken out. And you don't do this all overnight. You just increment forward in the right direction. Because unlike the climate change problem, every locality matters in natural capital terms. Conceptually, climate change is incredibly easy. It's about a few gases, and it doesn't matter where they're emitted, right? And we can measure them. Right? Of course, the policy is very difficult, but the problem conceptually is easy. Okay? When you come to biodiversity in the natural environment, the units vary enormously, ecosystem, species, but the crucial issue is the location matters. It does matter in every location what you do. You can make a difference by doing backyard diversity, just as you can make a difference by protecting global ecosystem hotspots like the Amazon. These contributions matter. Every bit is aggregatively, get it right, helpful towards the outcome. Now, the fourth general principle is really about non-renewables. And I've summarised that earlier when I mentioned it. The general economic principle is if you want to spread the benefits of non-renewables, which will be depleted, someone has to use them, then you should reinvest the economic rents. Now, you may not have noticed in these remarks, I've talked about a hell of a lot of money without mentioning public expenditure once. Right? If the property rights are there and there's compensation for the damage done, the money will be there to ensure that the aggregate is maintained intact. Developers who want to take out bits of natural capital will have to compensate. Other people who do damage will have to compensate. People who emit pollutants into the environment will have to pay for the damage they cause. That's a green tax stream and a lot of money saved from the perverse subsidies from the Common Agricultural Policy. And if we had a proper sovereign wealth fund, I actually regard it as a nature fund in my book, for the depletion of the North Sea, that's a lot of money. Take a look at Norway's sovereign wealth fund. I have described a set of funding which is larger than the environmental movement has ever contemplated, without a penny of public money, and all of which improves the growth rate and efficiency of the economy. That's really important, and that's what's distinctly different, and what I stress in my book, from the normal way in which people think about environmental issues, which is it's us versus the economy, and how much can we get the local authority or government, central government to pay in the budget to DEFRA or to the local government provision. A, it's hopeless, there isn't going to be any money, there's going to be less of it. But B, my point, which is really important here, is if you're genuinely economically efficient, you don't need it. And that pays for things. Now, I was going to give some particular examples. These are very much my own, though one or two of them are touched on by the Natural Capital Committee. Supposing you bought the idea that we wanted to, in a generation, improve the natural capital. 25 years is the best guess of generation, that's why it's a 25-year plan. We said in the Natural Capital Committee, and I take the line in my book, that if this is what you said in the white paper, if this is what you mean you want to do, if that is your objective, government, then this is what follows. You have to do these things practically to improve that natural environment. And we didn't specify in any detail in the Natural Capital Committee what those things would be, because in 3 years we were mostly concerned with setting out the framework, the concepts, the measurements, the accounting, and then the concept of the 25-year plan. But let me tell you a few things that I would put in my 25-year plan. The first is, pretty easy and obvious in one sense, is I would take every river catchment in Britain and develop a natural capital framework for each of those with the accounting that goes with it. There's a paper on my website on this. I would develop a system operator just analogous to the system operator we use in the energy that National Grid does, coordinate the agricultural side with the floods, with the water companies, with the the more nature parts of the natural environment together. And it's pretty clear and straightforward from the examples that are already apparent that there are significant efficiency gains to be made. At a fairly localised level, South West Water have been involved in improving the water holding qualities at the top of the River Exe on Exmoor by stopping up drains, allowing the water to be held, the flooding and the bogs, etc., which allows them to offset some of the hard capital costs that otherwise would have to be spent in Exeter when the flash floods come straight down the river because the moorlands have been depleted. And the payoff on the side, I happen to spend a lot of my time in Exmoor in terms of the nature environment, the biodiversity, etc. on Exmoor are extraordinarily large. But on a larger scale, Be About My Wildlife Trust, one I'm Vice President of, has been developing a catchment plan for the whole of the Upper Thames. The nature reserve down the road from my house is extremely good at absorbing floodwaters and holding them, which has a net benefit to Oxford in terms of its vulnerability to flooding downriver. There's a Thames path. There's the whole framework down through the sewage systems, through the cleaning of the water, through the attempts to think through how to get agricultural policies designed so that people don't plough up the riverbanks and put the silt in, as of course they did in the Somerset levels when the perverse subsidies which encouraged the maize growing led to sharp runoff at the top, put the soils into the River Parrett, and then, of course, there were claims that the government should spend 100, 200 million to protect, 100 houses from flooding from the soils which had been put into these rivers, which had come from the perverse subsidies upstream. So when you think about a river basin system, etc., we have completely separable policy frameworks without much consideration of the interaction between them, and each framework, each catchment has those opportunities. A second area, I'm just throwing out some policy suggestions, is to think about green spaces in cities. Now, one of the things we identified, and it's probably obvious to you, but we found quite surprising in the early days of the Natural Capital Committee, was just how huge the health benefits would be from reducing urban pollution. The numbers are quite stark. And if you look at the London Infrastructure 250 plan, you will find green infrastructure has a core component within that plan. I threw out the idea that we might want to go back to the original, in my book, Olivia Hartridge idea and the founding of the National Trust, and or the precursor to it, the Open Space Society, that we want to give green spaces to urban populations, particularly poorer urban populations. And how about the idea that nobody should be further than, say, 500 metres from a green space in any city? We could think about taking that across the whole economy, think about the air pollution benefits, the recreational benefits, the health benefits, and the social benefits. And that's a project which you might well think is what some of the compensation money and the revenues from the depletion of non-renewables might do. And that leads to two other areas of policy which I think are very pertinent. My colleague Ian Bateman on the committee, extraordinarily impressive and productive economist who specialised in a lot of the cost-benefit analysis areas, and we're very fortunate to have him, has looked at the benefits of the location of woodland. You'll be aware that there have been lots of plans to plant more woods. And he shows something very obvious, which is if you're interested in human benefits and the economic return from woodlands, you want to bang them right up against the city, because that way the maximum population can have access, use and benefit from those woodlands. Whereas if you stick them in the middle of Wales, not many people will have the benefits from them. Now, there might be other ecological reasons why you do that, but what he suggests is if you really want to think about the greatest economic gains, put woodlands next to cities. And I think he has an example of Cardiff or somewhere similar in Wales to compare with mid-Wales and estimates the difference in the benefits. Once you think about it, it's pretty obvious. Indeed, much of our urban population doesn't have the benefit of woodland access, the improvement of air quality that comes with it, and their kids don't get the chance to climb trees and enjoy those green spaces. Now that leads to the fourth point, and I have a paper on this too on my website, which is the green belt, which is highly controversial. There is an argument amongst those who would concrete over the green belt that what we should be doing is recognising that the green belt contains quite a lot of relatively low grade environmental assets. Intensively farmed agriculture. Horticulture is one of the terms that's used by those who would love to concrete over it, because it must be the elite that's going to suffer as a result. But golf courses come into fire too. And they say, since the biological, biodiversity, ecological value of this stuff is pretty low, and since there isn't much access to it, hey, why don't we concrete over the east of Oxford? We don't quite extend it to Port Meadow on the west of Oxford, but Oxford is one of the cities that this argument is most intense. Because if we could plonk some more houses on the edge, this would somehow improve the traffic of Oxford. I struggle with that notion. Every day indeed. But this would create houses for workers and therefore reduce house prices. And Oxford is a very high house price area. Now, this approach may or may not have merit, but it displays a fundamental lack of imagination. You know, the choice is not between what you might technically call crap green belt and luxury executive houses or whatever it is you want to build, or workers' houses or social houses. The choice is between having a green belt that's genuinely green, the current brown green belt, or houses. And because the work that people like Ian Bateman have done show that green spaces next to population have highest value, imagine if the east of Oxford was of the same quality as Port Meadow on the west. Imagine if we used that land instead of subsidising intensive agriculture to open up access. Suppose we bought it in the public interest even and created a public good. This is exactly where you wanted to go. And people say that not to build on the green belt is elitist. Rubbish. Olivia Hartridge at the beginning was concerned about the poor working class and the health conditions they had in urban areas and giving them access to green space. It's as if only the rich want green space. The poor need green space too. In fact, they probably need it more than the rich do because they can go somewhere else and enjoy the countryside. Now, that doesn't say that the green belt should be always and everywhere protected, but it tells you that if you apply the natural capital concept in this area, it changes the frame of the debate. And that leads to just a very brief mention of the last area, which is agriculture. I struggle to think how you could make it worse. I mean, really, you know, it is true that if you go back to where we were 5 years ago, it was probably worse. But it's one of those areas where you want to ask your students, try and design something that does more damage, that's less economically efficient than you've currently got. I don't know an economist who thinks, or probably who's ever thought, that the Common Agricultural Policy is a good policy. Why have this drag on economic growth? Why incentivise farmers to do the wrong things? Now, the last Secretary of State, Owen Paterson, tried very hard to reform the Common Agricultural Policy. If I were renegotiating Britain's relationship with Europe, this would be pretty high up my agenda. And I suspect there are quite a lot of allies too to move on the path to improve that. So those are just some examples of some of the areas one would start thinking about these issues. There are general principles: capital maintenance, compensation, pricing pollution, and setting aside the non-renewable depletion for future generations. There are particular areas where we can make and identify improvements in efficiency in terms of projects. There's a huge array of ideas that people have out in the environmental movement, industrial and other areas of things we could do within the framework of this 25-year plan. But remember, holding the line comes from the compensation. So anything above that, which comes from funds from the depletion of non-renewables and so on, and the green taxes, is a net improvement. That way you achieve the objective of the white paper. That way you improve the long-run growth rate of Britain. That way you go down an efficient route. All three political parties said they wanted to do this. All three political parties supported the white paper in 2011. The proof will be in the pudding. It's out for them now to see whether they genuinely want to take that agenda forward, or, as has happened in the past, vested interests, house builders, NFU, others, etc., pursuing quite legitimately their own aims, undermine that programme. And for everyone in the room here, what I've described is how your children can have a better natural environment than ours, and economic growth, properly measured, be higher than it is today. That's a choice, and it's been a privilege for 3 years to chair the Natural Capital Committee in setting that out. I've set out some of the ideas in my book, and I'd be delighted to know what I've got wrong. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dito, for that. That's very fascinating and thought-provoking speech, and I like the way you linked it to some very specific challenges around water, around house building, around greenbelt, and so on. I think that's where this whole thing becomes, people can get their heads around it when you start talking in those terms. I'm keen to bring in Mark as well. So as I said in the introduction, Mark has worked at a major landowner, as I have, and thought about natural capital. And now you're working with lots of businesses. It seems to me from Dieter's speech that if you're essentially describing, Dieter, that this is not about asking for lots of government money. It's actually about the compensation part of your argument, and the polluter pays part of your argument seems to be if you don't get those bits of it right, there's absolutely no way you'll finance, there's no way you'll do any of this, there's no way you finance any of this. And actually, there's a huge role for business in that. It's the businesses making the right decisions. And
I should have said, businesses naturally think about balance sheets and assets.
yes.
Only government thinks that it can do its accounting without any balance sheet or any assets to describe.
So I guess I'm keen to understand how far are businesses getting with this? Have you got examples of businesses putting this into practice, this thinking, and how's the work of the coalition going?
So I will answer the question, but just to give you a bit
absolutely.
of explanation about what the coalition is. You've got on the stage here an NCC and an NCC. There's the NCI mentioned there. There's also the NCP. There's quite a lot going on in this space at the moment. I think that in the last, we were just talking earlier on, the last 6 months even, the momentum is ridiculous. It's like we were 20 years ago with Rio. There is an awful lot of momentum here. I do apologise, we are another NCC. The coalition was set up after the Teague report in 2012. There was a dinner the night before the Teague report was relaunched. And at that dinner they said, it's great, we've got another great report. And that's why standards and reports are so important. That's why we have so many of them. We've got another great report. And there was the whole thing, the down just before the launch saying, oh, we need to do something about this. So the coalition came out of that, and the reasoning was that there was so many different initiatives around doing different things. And for me, we're coming to another era, an epoch that's coming on now, where the last 200 years of industrial revolution, we've been getting very good at expert delving into different areas. What we're now getting into is coalitions and collaboration being the way that things work. And there's lots of reasons for this, social media and various other things that are leading this. But the coalition is definitely a moment of its time. So within the coalition, and it's a global coalition, it's set up in Singapore, then moved to Amsterdam. It's in London at the moment because that's where my wife is and I'm the executive director. It's likely to keep on moving, can't work out which way, but I was launching the Irish Forum for Natural Capital the other day. The Canadian one launched the week before that. We're likely to keep on moving around the world as this goes. It's a global coalition. Within it, we've got businesses, which make up about 25%. We've got policymakers, so lots of governments from around the world are involved, including DEFRA and other departments here, DFID as well now. We've got academia, scientists. We've got NGOs, civil society. And the difference is, I think, is about bringing those together, building upon the great work that's going on in the CNCA, the Corporate Natural Capital Accounting that's going on here, but there's other stuff going on in Australia, in Mexico, and trying to find a way of getting all this together. So to answer your question about the business piece, I got funding initially for doing a pilot. We're developing a protocol, standardized approach for business to get their way through this river, okay, of all these different things going on. This is a standardized approach to decision making. It's not a reporting framework. There's plenty of reporting frameworks out there. Not enough to cover this, but there's plenty of reporting frameworks out there. But what we're doing is helping companies make better decisions. And at the moment, there's no standardized approach to that. There's lots of different ways that the leading companies are using. So we're developing that protocol. It will be launched next June. We will have a global protocol for companies to use. The funding I got was for 8 or 9 companies, and you can probably all name them yourself now. They're the same companies that always do these things. They were the ones that were going to be doing this. So we went out to them and said, would you like to be involved? And then we had some people knocking on the door, and then we got up to about 50. Then we got up to about 100. We're at 150 signed up for piloting now with a longer list of 300. So we've gone beyond that usual group of companies that do this into a much more global, much more interesting different sectors as well. And I think that the reasons that they're coming back to do this, there's 4 different things they're doing. The first one is about efficiencies. They want to find efficiencies in their operations. They're used to looking at profit and loss, and they realize that there's efficiencies here. There's things they're not managing properly. The second one is about opportunity. There's several companies and organizations that are making money out of this. It's not just about negative impacts, there's positive impacts as well. There's also those dependencies that they're reliant upon, and it's about finding those opportunities in it. So you've got efficiencies and opportunities. There's a few companies that are doing this for reputation, but to be honest, most of them aren't doing it for reputational benefit. The main one that came out by, and we've just done a report which will be launched next week, which is the first time I'm aware that anyone's done a a real review of the market, asking businesses what they understand, what they want to do about natural capital. And that will be launched on the 16th. But within that, the main one that came through was around risk. Now, a lot of these companies have had major issues in their supply chains over the last few years, a lot of it to do with climate change and other things, but these are things that really have disrupted their business, affected their profit and loss quite considerably. So that's something that's going to be a big driver for them. The other one that came up quite significantly is that most of these companies expect the next bit of legislation to be around natural capital in some way. And this isn't just in the UK, this is all over the world. And what they want to do is they want to get ahead of that curve, one, to be involved in that conversation, but also to be able to start making sure that they're in a place to be able to answer it. Whether that's about reporting, which is one element, and just to be very clear again, we're not creating a reporting framework, we're helping with decision making, or whether it's about other things as well. The policy debate is a big thing that's being played there as well.
So I think that, it sounds like, I've noticed this as well, that businesses are really moving in this direction. They are starting to think about it. There's more and more debate about how you measure these things and which things should be included and how they should be audited and which firms you should get to do it and all this kind of thing. I suppose I sense a slight gap between some of what Dieter's saying about, very hard measures to force companies primarily to pay for the damage that they do, to compensate others and to invest in natural capital. That's quite a big statement, effectively. And from what I've seen of the companies, they're quite happy to report on what they're doing. What about paying for it? That implies a level of environmental taxation which is maybe far beyond what we have at the moment.
So let's unpack it slightly. Okay, so the Ecosystem Market Task Force was set up before us and did its report. Ian Cheshire chaired that, which is setting out to say there are a series of opportunities out there which could be taken, which may not be. And you mentioned supply chain. There are lots of other dimensions of that. The second dimension is risk and risk registers. If you've got asbestos in your roof and you're a company, you're required to list that out. Any shareholder wants to know what risks are within that framework. Now, quite a lot of natural capital falls within the framework of corporations and not governments. And risk registers are absolutely normal for companies to take forward. Now, of course, to use the phrase from your frame, the coalition of the willing will incorporate the coalition of those who think there are the most gains to get. Some of those are in terms of the perception of their customers, whether it be a food chain or whatever, what the sources are, because customers want those things. Some of them would be because there's assets they can exploit in a particular way. And to be brutal, for some of them it'll be because it draws a distinction between them and their competitors who are not doing this, and therefore they might be able to get some competitive advantage. I think it's far too early to impose compulsory corporate natural capital accounting on the private sector. I don't think it's ever going to, I don't think it's going to happen. But one of the things that's absolutely stunned us in the Natural Capital Committee is, we've drawn up a template of how companies should account for natural capital, mainly Colin Mayer's work. There's a paper on our website saying that out. We are stunned and actually almost inundated with companies and organisations that want to do this. We started a landowners group, and Crown Estates was a really powerful member of that. We included a whole series of organisations, including farming organisations in this country, who own land to try and do this natural capital accounting, take this thing forward. But the thing has really taken off. And there comes a tipping point where investors and others start saying, well, where are your risk registers on natural capital? And then the question is, well, why don't you do it? It's a bit like it's not compulsory for boards to follow particular practices between chief executives and chairman, but it's now pretty embarrassing if you don't do it. So I think that's a very powerful area, and I'm actually quite excited about how fast that's going. And you guys have been driving a lot of these interest and engagement forward. We've just sat there as a committee with a small number of people and a very small resource and thought, oh my goodness, how do we cope with this?
We've got a small resource as well, but we'll get into that. I think also there's an element with when you go through this process, and we've done this at the Crown Estate, and there's lots of other companies, a lot of the water companies are doing a lot around this area. And although we're the two sector guides we're starting on, first of all, are apparel and food and beverage. The next 5 that we're lining up, one of the first ones is water. The water companies are very eager, but we're doing that through sector bodies as well, rather than just picking out individual companies, because that way it gets the whole market moving. But I think that when you go through the process, the first thing that you come up with is actually, oh my God, I didn't realize that was there. Now, the last thing you want to do when you find a problem is go out to your investors and say, hey, I found a problem, isn't it great? No one ever does that. What you do with the reporting element is you say, I found a problem, but you know what? We've also found some of the solutions to this.
But to take your example slightly further, I mean, water companies are a great start on this. They control a lot of our natural capital in our country. They have a deep interest in pursuing this because actually it can reduce their costs. Because a lot of their costs are imposed by bad land management of uplands, by pesticides coming into the system at the wrong place, etc. And they can see that an integrated catchment approach, including the floods, is cost effective.
They're already doing.
And that's why you get this, you know, it's not, again, it's back to my point about the crazy Marxist dialectic that pervades this area, where it's, you know, the environment versus companies, etc. The companies can see that there's a lot of opportunity here. And going with the willing and demonstrating the advantages, for example, in the water catchment example I gave, is exactly the way to build this, rather than try some top-down imposition on people, which A, won't happen, but B, will maximise the opposition to the idea of taking these things seriously.
So I guess you both mentioned sort of opportunities. You know, companies would be interested in this, governments would be interested in this, if you can find these sweet spots where doing something in a natural capital way, or in a, you know, working with nature way, reduces cost, increases efficiency, avoids you having to spend loads of money elsewhere. That seems to me to be the area where this is, you know, you'll get a lot of traction for that kind of thing. It's just about thinking about problems in a different way. I think maybe just to look at your other examples, the one about Greenbelt, the one about building on land and paying, you know, to invest in a natural asset somewhere else. That's, I mean, it'd be interesting to bring Barry in. You mentioned local plans. A lot of this is to do with the way we think about land and property assets and how we regulate that effectively, and what we ask of developers of land and buildings. So, you know, that example implies quite a seismic shift in, you know, maybe it's Section 106 payments, maybe it's mitigation measures, but that's quite a substantial shift from where we are today, isn't it?
I mean, any house builder who can buy a piece of land, build houses on it, damage a natural asset and not have to pay for it, of course he's going to want that outcome. It's perfectly rational, right? But it's not the most efficient from the economy's point of view or society's point of view, because they're just basically saying, I want to reduce the property rights of the rest of you, and I don't want to pay for it. Well, of course they don't, right? But that's not an efficient economic outcome. That lowers our economic growth. That's the point I'm making. And that's why, you know, of course, various interested groups who might have not been paying for damage they caused and now have to pay for it won't like it. I'm sure people who owned buildings that had asbestos in it didn't like the idea that suddenly they'd have to pay compensation for it, right? But, you know, that is not to be confused with what maximises economic growth. And that's the internalisation of these externalities, to put it in economic terms. An economic textbook 101 is straightforward. If you don't internalise an externality, the economic value of the output will be lower than it otherwise would have been. It's true of carbon, it's true of all these other developments. That's because at the heart of an efficient economy, being really boring, Arrow-Debreu general equilibrium if you're an economist, property rights are fully defined. And property rights mean that externalities are paid for and compensation is paid if property rights are damaged. That's why trade takes place. That's why an economy functions. And this is a massive imperfection in the economy, which leaves us all worse off, poorer than we otherwise would have been, with a lower economic output, and, hey, lots of the other things which are of fantastic human and other value not included.
I think there's actually also a way of looking at this that begins to expand the base of natural capital as well. And if you look at the offsetting principles, I'll give you an example of a factory site, previously allowed to build on 80% of the land, but the condition was that they had to keep a patch of green land within the boundary because that was their Section 106 obligation. Factory now wants to expand, and of course the local authority says, well, no, you can't. That patch of green land is actually a car park, it's a mud bath, it's of absolutely no environmental value whatsoever. But if you now start thinking about offsetting, and you then say, well, look, we'll allow you to expand the factory onto that bit of mud that you're currently parking the cars on, which was supposed to be your Section 106 obligation giving back to the public good, then in return, what you have to do is you have to do an extension to a piece of woodland that is actually high-grade biodiversity value, that's close by, that local people actually benefit from in terms of leisure and recreation and health and so on. So you actually engineer a situation which is allowing you to expand the biodiversity base, expand the natural capital base, and it's also allowing you to expand your economy. And there are real wins here if only we can capture them. I think one of the real problems with the way in which the offsetting pilots were done is they really didn't do this properly.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the tragedies of the white paper, that they set up this and everybody thought, great, we're going to actually see a way forward here that's going to be able to expand the natural capital base by good offsetting. And unfortunately, the examples were done very poorly. And it seems to have been quietly shelved. Now we've got an expert sitting in the audience, David Hill there from the Offset Bank, the Biodiversity Bank, who can take that a lot further. But these are the ways in which harnessing the idea of natural capital can actually be really productive, both for our traditional economy, but also for our natural capital.
And just in that point, Barry, I mean, there is an important, almost institutional point here. The real fear is that, and it came up in the offsetting debate, that this is just an excuse for doing a lot of trashing that wouldn't otherwise happen. And that means that you have to have a very clear, I hate the word, but almost the right word is regulatory framework. Someone has to adjudicate in an independent way that's not captured in this process. And there's no escape from the hierarchy. You can't compensate like for the destruction of a piece of ancient woodland. And it's not saying that the ancient woodland is worth X amount of money. It's simply saying what compensation would be required. And in most circumstances, the answer is there is no compensation. Okay? But if HS2 goes through a bit of ancient woodland, and 50 billion is being spent on HS2, right? Where's the compensation for the environmental consequences of that happening? And that this comes back to this kind of dialectic. The Green Movement hates this idea because they want to stop the project. Right? It's, this project or not. But the reality of expanding the population of Britain by 10 million, economic growth of 2 or 3 years, that quite a lot of these things are going to happen. And the real practical choice is, do you want to just fight in the ditch and then have the stuff done anyway and no improvement in the natural environment, a continued decline, as we have had for a very long time? Or do you actually want to do something which insists that the aggregate of natural capital does not go down, and that if this stuff done, there actually is genuine compensation that takes place? But you need some independence there, and I don't have an answer to who should do that, but I think it will have no credibility. And I think that was one of the problems with the offsetting paper, without having a genuine independent arbiter of that outcome.
Two things there. One, it was very interesting that the launch of the Committee on Climate Change's reports, their progress reports to government last week. But we were talking there about the way in which there could be an expansion of natural capital, the idea of natural capital budgets. And what was being mooted there was, look, we don't have a single currency here. That's the problem with natural capital is there isn't a single currency. You can't just monetize it, as you were saying. You can't just say, well, it's ancient woodland is worth X amount of pounds, shillings, and pence. So what you've got to do is you've actually got to take different indicators, and that requires a much more qualitative judgment as well as a quantitative one.
Well, yes, but here is a really important distinction, which comes up all the time. People keep saying nature's priceless. You can't put a price on nature. Nobody's trying to do that. What we're saying is, how much resource should you spend on what? It's a resource allocation problem. Okay, so it isn't saying Twyford Down was worth 268 million, whatever it is. It's saying it was worth spending 90 million putting a tunnel through Twyford Down and preserving it, and that would be a natural capital outcome. Twyford Down would not have been sliced in half in its current framework. It would have had a tunnel through the middle. It's about how to allocate scarce resources. Given they are scarce, there are competing ways of using resources. Where is the best environmental return for that money? Okay? And that is an inescapable currency. It's called resource cost, and that is money, but it's not valuation. That's a different concept.
The other point is,
I have a chapter in the book trying to explain that point, but environmentalists come at any economist immediately and say, you're trying to put a value on nature. And I try and explain detail in the book. No, that's not what we're doing.
the other quick point I just wanted to make about what you said about HS2 is that it really is tragic the way in which, when you talk about ancient woodland being destroyed in HS2, and you get a response from government that is saying, oh, but don't worry, we're building 2 million, we're planting 2 million new trees. Which just completely ignores the point.
This word
ancient woodland, and therefore the biodiversity value is
absolutely
incredibly poor.
Absolutely.
But actually, Kathleen Greening was somebody who got this right at the very first statement about HS2. And I actually asked her a question there and then. Everybody in House of Commons, of course, laughed. They thought, what on earth is he talking about? And I just said, look, will she ensure that HS2, as the biggest infrastructure project to hit our country in 50 years, actually becomes a biodiversity corridor, so that we have migratory corridors along HS2. She got it straight away, but then of course she was moved. But sadly, her successors hadn't. But the opportunities that exist with HS2 to create migratory corridors for species, to create new areas of woodland, to create new habitats and environments for species that are going to have to migrate north and up and down, is really important. And we're losing the sense that we can take this, mold it, and use it to enhance natural capital, rather than simply thinking, if you're going to drive a railway through the country, you've got to compensate by doing something else. It's actually an opportunity as well as a loss.
I'm keen to get the audience, get a bit of audience participation going as well. I think it's a really interesting discussion. But let's throw it open to the floor for some questions, and then we'll maybe have some concluding remarks from the panel as well. I think the first hand was on the left-hand side. There's a microphone coming around, sorry. If you could say your name and organisation.
It's David Hill from the Environment Bank. I'm also Deputy Chair of Natural England. I think what I would say is that one of the pilots was done in Warwickshire, and we've been sticking with that. And we've now got about £15 million worth of funding for creating new habitats on what we're calling habitat banks. And the reason why that's important is that we're backed by, we're partnered with Associated British Foods, who want to actually see the environmental performance of farming improved, which was in Dieter's report, was a really important factor. So we're trying to bring together how you can create large-scale new habitats on farmland, which is at the moment is, as Dieter says in his book, the damage, the environmental damage that's being created there is massive already. And so we're linking the developer. We've done about 150 development schemes. We've got 15 million in the situation going into the natural environment. And we're having no pushback from the developer. They just do it. And the key is, Dieter mentioned one thing, which is some form of framework. I think that needs to be done by the likes of Natural England in some form of accreditation scheme, which will drive a framework. The second is that within this room, there must be a lot of people who could inform planning authorities that they can actually deliver this already under their legal obligations to biodiversity. They can do this. Warwickshire is doing it. And if we could scale this up, it would be hundreds of millions of pounds coming into the natural environment. So I think, you know, it's moved on a step, but we need that extra push. And if we could get to central government, DCLG in particular, to say to planning authorities, get on and do this, wouldn't that be great? It's not a question, but I just thought I'd give you a few of the facts on that.
Comment. There's a question in the middle on the right-hand side.
I'm Dominic Hogg. I'm chairman of Eunomia Research and Consulting and also of the West of England Nature Partnership. So the first was just a comment back to Barry in terms of how the nature partnerships are working with the local enterprise partnerships. It's a very mixed picture across the country. We're in a fortunate position, I think, of having a reasonable level of engagement. I now sit on the strategic solutions panel of the joint spatial plan for the 4 unit trees of what used to be Avon. And so we're hopeful that we'll have some influence there. But I would say the problem with that relationship comes back to exactly what Dieter was saying in relation to how the government measures GDP and actually how the government is asking the LEPs to measure their performance, which is in GVA. And so that's the sort of local parallel. And it means that we're working effectively with one arm tied behind our back. We'd like a local partnership where we're integrated into the economy. But the question really is for Dieter, which is in relation to your points about polluters paying. And with the budget coming tomorrow, we're hearing a lot about George Osborne starting to rein back on promises to increase levels of green taxation, even after adjusting the definition of green taxation in the previous government. I wonder whether you could comment on that and what that might imply for the type of approach you were suggesting.
Very quick reply to that. I mean, polluters don't like paying, right? And we're the polluters. We're the people who consume all the stuff. We're the people who produce carbon emissions, right? It's carbon consumption, not carbon production that matters. I mean, so there's a natural resistance to do this. But I mean, you know, I suppose what I'm trying to do is to say, if you want to maximize economic growth, if you want to do this efficiently, then this is what you should do. If for political reasons you don't want to do it, or you don't want to offend particular interest groups, or you don't want us, the general public, to pay the costs of what we're doing, then the outcome will be less efficient. And the Natural Capital Committee has been very clear. If you want to do what your objective is in the 2011 white paper, if, as explicitly it says, you want to stop the rot in the natural environment and leave the natural environment for the next generation in a better state, these are the most efficient things you can do. We live in a democracy. If you choose not to do these things, fine. But don't tell us you're trying to pursue the objective. Be honest and say, actually, the public won't vote to improve the natural environment. Let's be clear. And that's very important for anybody like the Natural Capital Committee. It's not our job to make policy. It's our job to say, as indeed a good civil servant should in a way, tell us what you want to do. And in my book, I explain why what they want to do is the right thing to do in terms of why the aggregate of natural capital is suboptimal at the moment. Then you tell us what you want to do. I've got the white paper. I am the creature in the Natural Capital Committee of the white paper. I'll tell you what you need to achieve that. And that includes a 25-year plan. That's core to that. But up to you. But I do think that we need some political honesty. If you don't want to do these measures, fine. But don't pretend that you're pursuing the objective. And I'm very clear about that.
So Barry, whether you wanted to comment further on that?
Just to pick up what David said, David, that would be lovely. The trouble is that most local authority planning departments, as you well know, have long since got rid of their ecological officers. They don't have the planning departments don't have local ecologists. And they're not capable, therefore, of doing what you and I both know would be the sensible thing to do. On your point about the variability, let's put it that way, you're absolutely right, it is varied, but the key point is the one that you've made. They're asking you to account for your success in the wrong denomination. And actually, government has already accepted that by 2020, the Treasury will switch to the system of environmental economic accounts. It is the new UN standard for accounting. And there will have to be those parallel green accounts in place. Now, the Treasury knows that's coming down the line. I doubt very many other departments of government know that, and they're certainly not telling you down with the local enterprise partnerships and the local nature partnerships.
There's a question right down here at the front.
Hi there, Jonathan Leake. I'm the environment editor at Sunday Times, and
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Jonathan Leake,
Oh,
environment
Jonathan,
editor. So it's a question for you, Dick. So, if we were to adopt the capital-based accounting system you suggest, would we still be in recession? And what did George Osborne say when you told him that?
Okay.
And, sorry, one other question. What thought did you give to natural capital in the context of the atmosphere? By which I mean pollution and CO2. That's a separate issue.
Okay, so what would be the impact of national income accounts of a deduction for capital maintenance? Okay, now you might think that, well, there's an answer to that. Okay, but first of all, you have to have the assets to work out what's depreciated. So you have to do your balance sheet. There is no balance sheet. Okay, so we don't know. Okay. You can't, I mean, you tell me what you think the value of, it's not just about natural capital, this is about physical infrastructures, transport systems, all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, why would I have a guess, right, at knowing what the true capital maintenance of our railway system ought to be, okay? All you can say is, since there isn't provision of capital maintenance explicitly, but there is some maintenance expenditure. It's not the government isn't spending money on maintenance, it's just that it's not against a proper measure of capital maintenance. The number will be different. My guess is that the net effect on the deficit would be would be greater than it currently is. But on the other hand, you know, what is the composition of the 3% economic growth rate we've currently got? Okay, well, the answer to that question is it's not clear because we haven't got the assets against it, but the growth rate's there. But remember, too, when you get terribly excited about economic growth rates, we have a very sharply rising population. So it may be that GDP's going up, but GDP per head is not rising very much. So to give you a rough idea, we're about 0.6% of GDP in GDP term measures above where we were when we went into this crash. But we're about 6% ahead in terms of aggregate GDP. Okay? So you've got several things going on here. And you know, we've had 6 people on our committee. We're all extremely part-time. We have a very small secretariat. If you look at what we've produced over the 3 years, I would say everyone's done vastly more than they were asked for. They're a fantastic group of people. But the idea we could do the national income accounts, impossible. Now we have got, to pick up the points made, ONS, we've worked very hard with ONS. ONS have produced some initial estimates of natural capital as part of this process. It's been a long slog because the resources are required to do that. But I don't want to put this wrong, but to imagine there's a snap answer to this, Jonathan, is kind of, I mean, it's a mistaken understanding of the problem. You should know how ignorant you are, right, before you start to construct the component bits. Well, why is it politically sensitive? I mean, anyone can construct these numbers, and there's no hidden there's a huge amount on different ways of doing measurement of national income, net national product, etc. I don't see why, unless you think that the political objective is to find a measure that announces the biggest number possible. I could find you one that's much better than GDP, if that's what you want, right? But the reality is you can't escape this. And it's widely accepted that we're going down that route, including at the UN end of that equation. And, you know, it's kind of, I think this isn't about, you know, who had a conversation with what about which bit, or what did a particular politician say about this. I mean, again, forgive me putting it this way, we're trying to do something very serious, which is set up the proper concepts, the proper measurement basis, how to go about solving this problem, okay? And then it's for politicians to decide what they want to do about it. But we've done that core job, and that's what's in our 3 annual reports, I think. It's probably not the answer you want, Jonathan, but I think that's the right answer.
And on air pollution, the Natural Capital Committee in its second report
Yes, that's a good point.
actually quantified the cost to the economy. It was a big variation, but between 9 and 20 billion pounds a year. Now that was then on the COMEP report that said 29,000 people were dying prematurely, on average 8.5 years per premature death. And of course, that's without the benefit of the second COMEP report, which was delayed from January this year before the election to July, and we'll see if it comes before the summer recess, which is about to tell us that there's at least another 29,000 people dying from the nitrogen dioxide element, as well as the particulate matter PM2.5. So if you were to double those figures, you would get at least 18 million, possibly up to 40 million cost to the economy that the Natural Capital Committee has said is specifically down to what you asked, air pollution.
I suppose just to bring Mark into this, I've seen various companies attempt to do this just for a company, let alone a country, just to actually sit down and work out what all the, waste, air pollution, water, whatever, define a series of buckets that you want to try and measure, work out the measurements against those things, possibly try and put a monetary value on it. It's quite difficult, isn't it?
It's very difficult. I think, but also you've got all those different buckets, and each individual company is having different matrices, risk matrix, to choose which ones to go for. They're using different methods for it. The fact is that we need some standardized way to start thinking that through, which is why you need those sector guides that are going to go into detail about the risks. It's not about adding another layer on to these risk registers. It's about making sure that the risk registers that are there are taking account of this properly. So it's not a new system. It's using the systems that are already in place.
And I think there are two things to say there. First one is that not to measure something or not to notice the risk does not make it go away. Right? And that leads to the second point here, which is it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong, which is what happens if you do not take any of these considerations into account, because that produces you the lowest level of economic growth that you can have. So this isn't about getting precise answers, but every incremental bit forward in a particular location adds to natural capital in a way that it doesn't in the climate change debate.
And it's got to be about that object. What are you trying to do here as well?
Yep.
We're not trying to get down to one number. And we've got lots of finance institutions and banks involved in what we're doing at the moment. They're all saying, so if you can tell me that this company is 42 and this company is 46 on natural capital, I know where to put my money. Well, that's not the point. That's not the question. The question is the wrong question. What we've got to do is we've got to help those companies to make better decisions around that through a standardized way. I know that reporting is going to come at some point, but we can't do that unless we've got good data to base it on. At the moment, we don't have the data. We don't know what the asset stock is. That's where we've got to start.
And that's true on the national income accounting side too. It's the same
Yep.
point.
So I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to ask, we probably don't have any more time for any more questions. I know a few people have been waiting, but I wanted to ask the panel one more question myself, which is really to say, let's start with Mark. So what do businesses need to do next on this? What's the plan for the next 2-3 years to move this whole thing forward?
They need to start doing it. We need to start having, so we've created a business hub. So from all around the world, lots of case studies are coming together. All of the work from the Natural Capital Committee will be on there and other things as well to try and have this, to build on the momentum. So we need to get people to start doing this, making the mistakes, learning from that failure, getting that standardization together so that by in the next 2 or 3 years, everyone knows what they would need to do, how this fits into the WAVES government program as well. It can't just be done in business, how this fits into the finance discussions, but we need everyone to start doing it, which is why if you think the GHG protocol, how long it took to produce that for climate change, what we're doing with natural capital now is we're trying to produce something much, much more complicated in a year, okay? You could say that's foolish, but we need to build upon the momentum that's there now and just get people doing it. That's the era we're in.
Barry, sort of the same question, but what's the role of government here? What does the government need to do over this parliamentary term, let's say, to move this forward?
Okay, look, I'd say it's the same as I would answer if I were answering for business. Manage your assets properly and manage your risks properly. I mean, I mean, if you've got confidence in any management, that's what you've got confidence in. You've got confidence that they're looking at their assets, that they're managing those assets properly and productively, and you would look at their risks and say, yes, they're cognizant of what risks face them down the line, and you can only be cognizant of those risks if you've actually worked out what your supply chain is, what your assets are, what the vulnerabilities are for those assets, and you've done a thorough review of your business model. Now, government needs to do that. We need to have a chief secretary for the Treasury who is responsible for natural capital. We need to have somebody doing exactly that job of, that the chief secretary does, that's saying, we look at the departments across the board and we say, what is your department doing in its policies? Is it depleting natural capital? Is it enhancing natural capital? Is it taking shortcuts in your asset management? Is it taking shortcuts in your risk appreciation? And if it is, then you've got to get it right. Otherwise, you don't get an approval from the Treasury to have the spend to do what you want to do. It's a policy blocker there. Somebody who's controlling that and ensuring that government manages this properly.
And Dieter, the Natural Capital Committee clearly has a very important role. It seems like you've done a lot with limited amount of resource, in your own words. What does the NCC look like in 2-3 years' time? Does it become a bit like the Committee on Climate Change for Carbon? Does it stay being an advisor? Does it become the sort of arbiter of these difficult decisions? What's the role going forward?
Okay, so this is quite practically important in the short term. So the Natural Capital Committee had one phenomenal great advantage, which was it was a time-limited committee which is going to drop dead after 3 years. I thought that was fantastic, because then as chairman I can say, what is our terms of reference, what do we have to do, work back from 3 years back to the present and say, now over to you, make some decisions about what to do. I'm against committees that just go on forever. Okay? And we should have finished in March. And the third natural capital report, we did 3, one each year, builds up. The third one says, essentially answers the terms of reference we were given. It sets out the framework of the methodology, tells you how to do the assessment, and it tells you why you need a 25-year plan to produce that outcome. So if you want to achieve the white paper, this is what you need to do. Now, perfectly understandably, ministers came along to me and said, look, we can't possibly produce a government response to a report which was actually supposed to come out in March, but I fast-forwarded to January to make sure it would be ahead of the election so people have to discuss it. Will you stay on for 6 months as a committee until the end of September in order to receive our response? Because we can't give a response to a committee that doesn't exist. It's just, yes, Minister, you couldn't make this up, but it's obvious if you think about it, okay? So we're sitting there waiting to receive the response. Actually, we're not. We're getting on with lots of stuff because this is an urgent agenda. So the government has to decide what does it want to do with the Natural Capital Committee at the end of September. Okay? Now, I don't think it's the job of any committee that's timely to tell the government or advise the government what it ought to do with its committee. That's too self-servicing. Okay? Okay? So we deliberately have not said you ought to do this. And I'll give you a personal reason why we don't have an answer to that, is that actually the wrong thing to do is to say, we have a committee called X, let's carry on this committee. Okay? And it has the potential deadly consequence that it just goes on, but, well, we've got a permanent committee out there doing stuff. What's it going to do next? There's no kind of hard bite. So I think that you have to decide whether you want to do the 25-year plan. You decide that. In other words, whether you want to implement what we recommended. If you decide you want to implement what we recommended, then you have to think of the institutional structure to do it. And 6 people doing 1 or 2 days a month with a couple of people in the secretariat is not the right frame to do that. So you have to rebase this thing. And actually most of the political parties in the last election, and credit to Barry too, has probably thought about this more amongst politicians than almost anybody else, had grasped that. So you have to ask some quite big questions. Is the structure of the environmental institutions that you've got more generally up to the task of doing this? And personal remark, not an NCC remark. I wrote substantially when the quinquennial review was done of Natural England and Environment agencies about the need for a proper environmental protection agency, about the need to take floods outside the Environment Agency. I've made a whole series of proposals on that front. Now, fortunately, unfortunately, it's not my job to decide. The quinquennial review basically left the institutions as they are. I personally think that's a mistake, but it's actually a question which I think should be revisited if you want to think where you want to locate, not just the kind of arbitrating or the regulating or the assessment, but who's going to do the day job? Who's going to own the data for this? Who's going to assess the thresholds? Where does this fit within our institutional landscape? So I would hope that the government's using the time between now and September to think quite hard, a bit more generally than what do you do with Helm and the Natural Capital Committee in September. So that's essentially where we are going forward. And I think we're moving, and it comes back to your excellent title for today, Richard, we're moving from getting the concepts right and working out what you have to do to achieve the objective to delivery. And that's the question between now and September, to work out who should do that delivery, what needs to be done, and I would hope that what we've done in the Natural Capital Committee is tell you what those things are you have to do. Right? But now, let's get on with it. I mean, every day the natural environment is not getting better, it's getting worse. And these economic opportunities are out there are not being taken, and those are benefits foregone. And, you know, there's an urgency. Well, September, the end of September is the deadline. I mean, by the way, I wrote my book and published my book to come out after the NCC had closed, so I'd have a clear distinction between what I thought about these things and the NCC. So it's somewhat sort of carrying on being chairman and setting out my own views. There's a certain tension in there, but yeah.
Excellent. Well, if we could all just show our thanks for the panel members. I think it's been a great discussion.